Good afternoon and welcome to the third Health and Wellbeing Strategic Research Area Seminar Series presentation. But today it's going to be a little bit different, where Teresa and I are going to have a conversation about a publication that she wrote and was published by Palgrave December 2020. So first and foremost, I'd like to introduce Dr. Teresa Crew, who is a senior lecturer in social policy at Bangor University. And Teresa and I are going to be talking about her publication, which relates to higher education and working class academics, precarity and diversity in academia. And we're just going to have, an informal conversation. We're going to talk about the overview of Teresa's book, as well as what piqued her interest in this area, which is underrepresented within research, and for many people in the academy don't really want to acknowledge that there are working class academics. So Teresa, welcome, and it's great that you and I can connect at last. I know we've been following each other on Twitter. So congratulations on your publication from last December. For the listeners and those who are going to be watching this podcast, do you want to explain a little bit about your book, please?
Yeah, sure. So I'll come to the reason why I wrote the book later on, because I remember you were going to ask me that. But basically, the book is about, I've spoken to approximately 90 people who identify as being a working class academic. I let them self-identify rather than me set a criteria of what that means. And I basically had 3 research questions. What makes somebody a working class academic? Also, I asked about the negative experiences they may have had being a working class academic, and then also what they bring to academia by being a working class academic. And they were the 3 research questions, and the interviews tended to last for about an hour, maybe 2 hours sometimes, because I've got people that has an awful lot to say basically about their experiences, negative and both positive. The thing that really did stand out to me is that it was much harder to get people to talk about the positive experiences, i.e. what they bring to academia. And I actually found that quite sad, but that's a representation of the literature that's out there. That's why it was much harder to get them to talk about those particular issues.
And when you were recruiting participants for your interviews, and I know you said you didn't set any criteria, but did anybody email you and say, I think I'm working class, or would I fit for your interviews? Can you describe what kind of criteria that you yourself and those interviewees as well?
So what I did, the most difficult part was working out what was an academic. That was the most difficult part, because when you look at the dictionary definitions, I had to go back and look at dictionary definitions. So I did have an awful lot of people contact me saying, do you think I fit this? So how I advertised it was, I'm doing research with working class academics. If you self-identify as being a working class academic, please contact me. The only other stipulation was that they had worked in academia in the last 6 months. Now, I did actually relax that stipulation as well, because I started to realise there were people that had left academia because they could not manage on the paltry money that at times that they were living off, because, well, they were in precarious contracts. So whenever somebody contacted me, I never defined to them whether they were working class or not, because it's not really for me to do that, because the problem that we have sometimes when we think about working classness is that we have this narrow, very, very narrow idea of what working classness is. So, for instance, somebody would mostly think, well, how on earth can I? So if I just take myself as an example, how could I be working class? But I didn't enter university as an undergraduate until I was 30, so I'm 49 now. I didn't enter academia until I was 30. I think it was about 32 I entered academia. By the time I'd finished my degree, that was in 2006, I then went on to do my master's. I had a couple of years break from a PhD. I've only actually experienced this middle class world for the past say 16 years, something like that. So if I all of a sudden start defining myself on being middle class, just on the basis of having a couple of qualifications, that says very little about the sort of the family background I had. It says very little about my day-to-day experiences. I mean, when I was a student, up until I gained my first permanent post, I've been skint all the time. And that is something, you know, the word skint you really can associate with being working class. You know, I had very little money. There were certain opportunities that were not available to me. So for instance, I had a lecturer when I was doing my master's who suggested I did an overseas, went overseas to do some research. That's something that's not available to somebody like me, because what I would have needed to do, I would have needed to pay for all this up front. It may have got reimbursed. That was never 100% clear. I would never have asked if it was going to be reimbursed. But I could not afford just to fork out a couple of £1,000s just to go overseas. And also I had children to look after as well. So it's very narrow when we think about people being working class as just somebody, for instance, in a low paid job. If we don't define people as being working class, if we look at define them by education, that also leaves out an awful lot of people. You can actually be educated and be working class. It's actually quite patronising when people just portray working class people as in low paid jobs, uneducated. It really doesn't, I don't think it covers the whole range of what it is to be working class.
I just want to tell you a little bit about me. I agree with your story, going overseas for research. I was unemployed for 11 months in 2016 and did a lot of interviews, both in the UK, online for overseas advertisements as well. And there was one particular university, and it was for a teaching research position. And the feedback on the phone was that if I could go and volunteer to do some teaching, then that may help me in the future. And, I did take it as an insult. And, I was receiving welfare, and I was fortunate to be living back at my parents'. So I wasn't having to pay rent or board, in those instances. And, I didn't have children to look after. So I basically had the £174 a fortnight. But I had, for me, the pressures of, trying to secure a permanent position, or a position, because I was only able to receive welfare for 12 months.
Yeah.
And, going to the job centre every fortnight and answering to somebody who is unfamiliar with how academia works, how the interviews work, there was a lot of stress there. I was very fortunate. I had a lovely person who I spoke to, and she told me that I was one of 4 of her clients who were in professional professions, areas of work. So she didn't really give me too much hassle, but it was, I just smiled when I was given that advice. I mean, if you how can you go and volunteer when you're spending your full days applying for jobs?
Yeah, you just can't do that. And I think in a nutshell, the difference, so there is an economic difference in terms of working classness, as in often, if you cannot, for instance, other colleagues we might have may have been very fortunate enough to be able to ask the parents for support, to be able to, to pay for them to go overseas, do that research, to volunteer, different things like that. As in, if you've got that safety net, that economic safety net, it's much, much easier for you there. So there is an economic angle to being working classes. That's just the idea that that you can actually get through some of the bad times. Like, for instance, one of the respondents I spoke to talked about how once her colleagues had finished the PhD, they took a year off, and they had a year off. They kind of found themselves after having the PhD and being very, very hard to do that. But the colleague that I spoke to, the respondent I spoke to, mentioned that she didn't have that option. She needed to find a job straight away, not after her PhD had finished. She needed one before that. So while she was going through the stress of actually doing a PhD, she was also looking for work and often having to, to do little bits of work here and there. And there's also another element where what she would end up having to do is that if she needed to take work, she'd have to take work from anywhere. And we know in academia, sometimes it's best to work in the most elite institutions. If you have that on your CV, it's going to look much better than if it's not an elite institution. Sadly, that's even in academia, that's how it works. So there's things like that. Just the money aspect really does play a huge impact on whether you can stay in academia and where you actually end up going as well. So the people that are in, like, for instance, in the most elite institutions, they're not always there. I would say mostly they're not there due to just their talent, and that's a sad reflection of academia, unfortunately.
And I think as well, with the safety net perspective, you know, I've been fortunate to work overseas in 2 different positions, Canada and Germany, as well as in the UK as well. And, you know, if you don't have savings and you need to ship stuff overseas, put up rent overseas and in the UK as well, you know, you may need a couple of £1,000 or £3,000 to tie you over to get things set up to then until your first paycheck comes in. Yeah. And as I say, I know I'm very fortunate because my parents were able to support me in that instance, but it's in that mindset, isn't it, of, yeah, can I do this? How much is it going to cost? Is it going to be reimbursed? When do I get my first paycheck?
And isn't it embarrassing to actually, if it's not clear, and often it's not clear whether it'll be reimbursed, the thought of actually having to ask somebody, oh, is this going to be reimbursed? I still would not feel comfortable doing that. So more than likely I wouldn't, like at the moment, I'm very fortunate to be where I have got savings, but that's only because I've been in an academic position for the last 7-8 years. But as in, when I first finished my PhD, I had no savings, you know, as in I actually worked full time while I was doing my PhD just to be able to manage, because although, again, and you see the word fortunate, you've mentioned it yourself, I was very fortunate that I was given a bursary to do my PhD, but that was £13,000 a year. That's not an awful lot to live on. I mean, as a single person, and obviously I had children as well. So I actually worked full time doing research elsewhere. Again, I was fortunate that somebody offered me a full-time position, but it's really not recommended to do a full-time job alongside a PhD. It's mentally exhausting, you know, so I actually don't feel I've ever had a break. So maybe, you know, the time that some people have those breaks, I'd like to have one of those eventually. So,
I'm totally with you. You know, I started my PhD in 2005. It was funded for 18 months. Yeah. And then there was no funding afterwards. So I became self-funded.
Yeah.
And I worked part-time, and I was doing my PhD part-time. And, you know, I submitted the thesis within 4.5 years. I couldn't take 5-6 years.
Exactly, yeah.
And back then, you know, there was some people at graduation who'd taken 10 years.
It's quite common, isn't it, to take that lot? I mean, if you finish in 4 years, that's unbelievable. Yeah,
and I think, you know, I think the rules have changed now, but, you know, my mind was focused because I was self-funded and I had to get it in by a certain date. Otherwise, I would have had to have paid another year's tuition fees of just under £700.
Yeah, exactly.
And I wasn't prepared to do that. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think as well, you know, when you're like your first generation into academia, you don't know the unwritten rules. You don't know, you're looking for you see job advertisements and the wording and what it means, and, you know, could one apply to that position? And I think, you know, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it, to me it's one of the challenges and downsides within the academy that it's not spoken about. You know, my graduate training is probably very different to maybe what it is now for people going through their PhDs, but to understand how to set out CVs and what kind of information you put in CVs, and writing a research statement and a teaching statement.
I've had to learn that, exactly those sort of things you're describing there. I've had to learn as I've gone along, and because I'm quite proud, I wouldn't really want to ask people, but I've had to ask people sometimes. But it's things that, yeah, nobody teaches us things like that. And if you're from a family, so for instance, if your family, and this is often many of the colleagues I speak to, their family there where their dad or mum was a professor, they've got a sister who's like, you know, a lecturer. So it's obviously going to be much easier for my children. But for me personally, when I was coming through, it was very, very difficult. You know, you're not told how to do these things. And I think it's a way, I have to say, it's a way of making academia closed to people. And that's what really does upset me, that even now, I mean, academia talks about being diverse. It's not diverse. It still is dominated generally by men from more elite backgrounds. That we still see that, and often people, if our students tend to see the same people and they don't see them reflected back at them. I just think it's so important. They need to see people like them in academia, in like research positions, as lecturers, as head of schools and things like that, not the same old people that they can't associate with at all. That's actually where the book came from, actually. That was the idea behind the book. So yeah.
I'm going to move on to one of my next questions. From the interviews that you conducted, was there anything or several factors that stuck out for you?
So there was two, but the first one, it kind of links into the second one anyway. But as I say, it was the fact that people really found it difficult to talk about the positive things that they brought to academia. And I think that's because, one, to do with that they're so used to that they're not the norm in academia, so they don't feel that they're going to be as good as everybody else. And the other part is the literature on this subject actually doesn't focus on the positive things that they bring. I really had to struggled to find that literature. But the other thing was the amount of microaggressions the respondents faced. I mean, in every part of their life, they're experiencing microaggressions. So microaggressions are these ways where it's not like an out and out attack, but it is like a verbal, it's like just like basically nasty little comments that they had to, you know, put up with. And these nasty comments included, I remember one of my respondents was actually at a dinner in one of the Oxbridge institutions, and somebody said, "Oh gosh, I bet you're not used to being in a place like that, are you?" And the person hadn't been in a place like that before, but was really embarrassed because, you know, it was all highlighted on this person. So he decided to joke about it and just said, "Well, no, I haven't. Normally, people like me are normally here to rob the place." So he tried to turn it into a joke because he was so embarrassed that it would be pointed out that he didn't obviously fit in. And then people, you know, that was actually a big thing at, you know, at dinners and things like that. "Oh, you know, this is the fork that you use," you know, presuming that person didn't know anything. Often there was quite some negative and nasty comments made about when my respondents were promoted. So there were comments about, "Oh, Athena Swan must be for working class women this year if she's got promoted." That was a comment that one of my respondents had. Also ethnicity as well stood out, where it wasn't just about being having classist like microaggressions. They also experienced racist microaggressions, comments made on females' bodies, on the shape, size on the bodies, about how attractive they were. Also about the Black working class men often had comments about sort of clothes that they were wearing as well. So it was just, I think what stood out was that how rude, absolutely disgustingly rude people were to my respondents. I think almost everyone had experienced really negative, nasty remarks about them at some time throughout their career. And that's just not nice at all.
Oh, it's not, it's toxic.
Yeah, chav was a few times my respondents were called. I'm not laughing because that's funny, by the way. I'm laughing because I cannot believe that happens in academia. Quite a few of my respondents were called a chav. Somebody was talking about the research and then realised, they said something, "Oh yeah, it's the chav estate." And then they realised, "Oh yes," and they said to my respondent, "You live there, don't you?" And it's like, it's this sort of way of talking that there's no seem to understanding about how rude and offensive and how classist these comments are. So yeah, that really stood out. I didn't expect, because I've not actually had that experience, to be fair. So that did shock me. I was quite shocked by that. So yeah.
One of my first, in fact, it was the first interview I had back in 2016, and it was at a very top tier elitist institution in the UK. And I went to the interview, and obviously I was suited and booted and dressed appropriately for an interview.
Yeah.
And I was prepared. And then at the end of the interview, I was asked the origin of my middle name.
Right.
My middle name is Ramsden.
Okay, yeah.
And I made some comment about my family background and where they came from.
Yeah.
And I just smiled sweetly to myself, because, you know, you're trying to figure out that person.
Yeah.
The primary interviewer was trying to figure out my background.
Yeah. But it should be about your qualifications and about your ability to do the job. Your background should have no bearing on that whatsoever.
Yeah. And I knew as soon as I was asked that question, I knew that I wouldn't be getting that job.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's fine. You know, do I really want to work in an environment with people like that?
Yeah.
And I'm sure we'll touch on it as well. You know, maybe some of your interviewees spoke about accents. I mean, I'm proud to be from West Yorkshire, from Pontefract, and you know, my accent's been tweaked over the years. I'm not going to sit here and say it hasn't, but I still have a Yorkshire accent, and you know, people from all across the country. You know, there's some beautiful regional.
Oh gosh, yeah, we should be proud of them, shouldn't we? Accent, yes. I mean, so what I found was people that lived in England. So I interviewed people all across the UK, but it was primarily in England and Wales that I interviewed. They were primarily where I did, and that mostly reflects, like, you know, the networks that I have. So if they were from particularly northern parts of England, and if they were from Wales, yes. I remember somebody was advised they better get rid of their Welsh accent very quick if they're going to speak to students. And strangely enough, with regards to the Welsh part, what I do notice, so I'm originally from England, but I've lived in Wales for many, many years. And whenever I've attended, like, for instance, like comedy events, I always find that the English people there always boo people from Wales. I always find it quite amusing, thinking, and what I find is that the you know, when I'm with my Welsh friends, we've always got a sense of humour about ourselves, but I just find that it's just a strange way that they just boo Wales. I never really understand why. But yeah, that respondent was advised to get rid of the Welsh accent. Many times my respondents, whoever, if they had a northern accent, they were always asked to actually try and get rid of that accent, try and smooth it. Somebody was at a conference speaking about the research, and a person said, I can't understand what you're saying because you're talking in a regional accent. And if I just explain with conferences, as you know, conferences can be quite nervous, and you feel quite nervous when you're at a conference. You're presenting your research to people that are in often much higher positions than you if they decide to attend. And it was those people that were the most negative, asking my respondents to change their accent. I can't understand you. You can't expect to get any higher with that accent. There's all these negative comments all the time. And I just think, again, this is something that is part of you. You can't be expected to change your accent just to fit in. It should be, again, about your research, the research you're doing, your teaching, how you are with your students. That should be, how you do your administration roles. That should be the most important, not if you have a Welsh or a northern accent. It's ridiculous.
Totally agree. And I think, if people who are being interviewed in future jobs and the interviewing panel were to actually do their job properly, and look at the skill set that is in front of them, then maybe there'd be less toxicity in the academy.
Yeah, because I just think about these poor people that potentially might come through and then they realise how toxic academia can be, it's going to put them off. And I did open up my criteria to people who hadn't been in academia for a while. And I spoke to, I think, about 2 people who had left academia. I think that's an area that I might perhaps go down, people who've left academia due to how toxic it can be, and to find out why. What was it about it that, I can guess why, it'd be the microaggressions experience, but it'd be good to do research on that area as well, actually, sadly.
So my next question is, what are 1 or 2 of your biggest challenges within this discipline or this area of research?
Let me think. So I think sometimes people focus on the definition part. People focus way too much on what is a working class academic, rather than just think about, as in, because as I say, if you think as working class being, you know, very much a broad spectrum. So as I say, I still class myself as working class because a number of reasons, I live on the same council estate I lived on when I did my degree. I have the same friends. The difference is my bank balance has actually gone up a bit due to the job that I have. So I think that we need to look at working class as like on a spectrum. It's much broader than this idea that, you know, it's a man wearing like a flat cap, for instance. You know, I'm sure there are many people that do wear a flat cap, but working classes is more than that. So I think that when we focus on because that then influences the research that's out there. It means the research just focuses on, it kind of like would exclude somebody like me and many of my respondents, and then it would also come at it from a very negative perspective. So I find that, and I'm always correcting whenever I'm at a conference or anything to do with research on, say, like access, anything to do with access to higher education, I always mention, we hear in the research that people from a variety of different backgrounds, not just, you know, if you're from a working class background, but if you're like not used to being in academia, it doesn't mean that you come into academia with no skills. And that seems to be quite prevalent in the area. Whenever we talk about people at disadvantage, there's an expectation that they have no skills. And the only thing it is that they may not have skills in the area that you're in at the moment, but they bring to academia their own skills, their own forms of capital. And I think really that needs to be emphasised. So for instance, students come into university who may be the first in their, you know, the family to go to university, they may not know how to write the perfect academic essay, but they will have skills in other areas. And we really do need to highlight those and not just see them in a negative light, which I think is really problematic. I think it influences how some lecturers, let's just say some, may approach teaching like first year students and things like that.
And you kind of, I guess, touched on it just now about the positives. What 1 or 2 positives about your area of research could you share with our audience?
So what I found is, so it's helped if I went back and just, so I actually did this research study because, so as I say, I'm a working class academic, and my students would often say, you're not like other working class you're not like other lecturers, Teresa, or you're normal. The word normal would get used over and over and over again. And I knew that it wasn't situated in gender. I knew that it wasn't, as much as I thought the word normal might have something to do with me being female, in terms of maybe being much more, female academics are perceived to be much more caring to students. I thought it may be something to do with that, but I kind of knew there was a classic background to it. So I just ended up speaking to a couple of colleagues who were from a working class background and also in higher education, and they'd had the same thing. So one of the factors that my respondents had over and over again was that how open and how let me think, just how fantastic the teaching was, in terms of that students could access their teaching in a much easier way. So for instance, if my respondents were talking about theory, if they were in STEM subjects, so science, technology, engineering and maths, they were much more able to explain complex things in much more simpler ways. Now, it's not to say that the students in our universities needs everything simple, but I don't think you should unnecessarily complicate things. And I think the academics that I spoke to, so it may have been about 3/4 of the people that I spoke to, mentioned how their students really did feel connected with the way that they taught. There really was. So I think that's such a positive. So when we think about working class academics, generally the literature does focus on the microaggressions they face and, you know, like, you know, some commentary about accents and things like that. However, we really do need to highlight that these working class academics have come through academia. Often they're still keeping many elements of the working classes, so they can actually teach much easier to students. It's almost like that middle part where we have, you know, lecturers from more affluent backgrounds, we have students, and in the middle of working class academics, where they can really, you know, they seem to interact much better with students. They're often the most popular lecturers as well. They're often the most favourite ones. And just that teaching style, they tend to make sure that it is much more, it can be consumed much more easier by students. And one of the things I do notice sometimes at times, now I love teaching. Every time I actually write a funding bid, I actually put that in my funding bid to explain why I don't want to, you know, do my research within 3 months, because I'm actually teaching. And I just think sometimes academia really does not promote teaching very much. And my working class academics, like myself, absolutely loved teaching. And in a way, they didn't want to get too high up because that takes you away from teaching in one sad way. But yeah, they were much closer to the students in terms of the way they taught. And also as well as that, because they were closer to students in the way that they taught, students felt much more comfortable going to them if they had any difficulties. And I mean, there's so many different ways that the academics I spoke to help students. They would be very, very supportive. Now, I really should say, this is not to say that the typical academic from an elite institution is not supportive of students. That's not what I mean at all. But often it can be much easier to come to somebody who you perceive is like you. And it's little things like my academics that I spoke to did, they held like local access to higher education sessions. These were like off the cuff, their own sessions. They would help people with writing statements. They would perhaps like even students who weren't in their school, they would look at their essays and things like that. There was even things like, there was somebody I was speaking to who actually made sure she looked at the reimbursement culture. So the way that we have to wait for money to get things, this happens to students as well, where they're asked to maybe be at an open day, and the students don't get paid for that open day till, say, at the end of the month, or maybe if the slip hasn't been put in on time till perhaps the end of the next month. So the academics, a number of academics I spoke to, made sure those students got paid straight away. There's just that awareness that I don't think the typical academic would have. And that's definitely those two things that they teach in a much more open, interesting way, and they're much more supportive. That's definitely the two areas that I found with the academics I spoke to. And that's a nice find, and it really doesn't get promoted as much as it should be.
No, and totally agree with the whole, you know, reimbursement. You know, I was fortunate in my master's to receive European social funding, and we had to put our slips in weekly.
Yeah.
But if they weren't processed,
yeah,
myself and friends and peers, we wouldn't get our money for 2 weeks later.
Yeah, and if you think of that being an undergraduate, you know, like in one way, maybe they're doing it with undergraduates to get them used to that you have to wait ages for your money in academia. But these poor students had, like, say, worked like, you know, all day on an open day, and they often didn't get paid till not that month, the month after. And I mean, you've got to think that's not going to encourage them to want to do it again. And it also reinforces that they're not important. I think that overall, that the finding that I had was the working class academics I spoke to saw students as being important. They loved the research, they loved doing research, the academics I spoke to, but they saw students as so important. So I think the government, like the Office for Students, really should be looking at working class academics as maybe the way that you should approach students. That's one of the ideas that I have.
and well, that leads on to my final question, which is a bit of a two-parter, Teresa. So how do you think classism should be tackled in the academy, and who should be involved in this change?
So I think firstly, we just need to acknowledge it. So many years ago, John Prescott, a Labour MP, who I actually do really like, he said class doesn't exist anymore. Well, that's very nice of him to say that, but it does exist for many people in many different ways. Before I even came here today, I was reading an article about Brian Cox, an actor, who talked about how so many people from working class backgrounds can't get into acting. And I'm pretty sure if you looked in any sector, class is an issue. So gender's an issue, ethnicity is, but also classes as well. There's all these different areas. We need to think about disability, all these different areas, but class is an issue. So we need to firstly acknowledge it, not try and shout people down when they talk about class and tell them that, well, no, you know, when do you become middle class? Once you go to university? Well, we have, you know, almost 50% of young people going to university, so that's ridiculous. So I think we need to acknowledge it first. And I think as well that we need to, if you're not from a working class background, that is not in any way to say that you've not struggled in academia at all. And this is something I'm always at pains to say, that it's not to say that you've not struggled, but it is important to acknowledge you've not struggled in some of the ways that I've outlined today. So I think that we need to make sure people don't feel the need to get on the bandwagon and say, well, I had it tough as well. Yes, you more than likely did. Academia can be very tough. However, there are certain ways that people from working class backgrounds have had it difficult, and we need to support them. I think if there's anything to do with, you know, anything to do with money, that should always be paid up front. But we need to think about how class will affect every part of academia. I've just got some here. So we need to make sure that we don't assume things about people. And that's either, we can't assume that people are not intelligent because they may come from your local university, the estate down the road. Let's not assume that those students are not just going to be as good as the students you've got from the wealthy estates as well. But also as well, we need to make sure that we have all the support available for people, so people don't have to come looking for that support. I think that's vital. The other thing as well, I think recruitment, when, like for instance, when people are, when departments are hiring people, quite rightly, they think about a gender balance. They think about a balance in terms of ethnicity, disability. We also need to think about how posh are our lecturers, how posh are our professors, and just think, you know, I think our students really do need to see people like them reflected back at them. When we don't actually see, like for instance, if I go into an institution and people like me are not there, I don't know, that institution has to work much harder to make me feel like I'm going to fit in. For instance, one of my respondents said that it's actually a story similar to what you said, where he actually went to an elite institution and he interviewed for a position, and they asked, well, how do you feel you'd fit in a place like this? And I just think straight away, you know, it's a job interview. He's going to feel nervous already, and you've already made him sound like he's different. So I just think the same way that we would, with students, incorporate personal learning support plans. I don't know if it's called something different in your institution. We would consider the ways students may be disadvantaged and support them. I think we need to do that in terms of class. And with regards to who should be doing it, I think we all should be aware of class. And I think one of the things we need to consider is that, for instance, you know, I have an unseen disability. I have epilepsy. But there are certain ways that my unseen disability is not going to affect me as negatively if I have a physical disability, for instance. And that is not, by me acknowledging that, that is not me trying to downplay the barriers I might face. But it's important we do acknowledge when people experience barriers. So I think everybody needs to acknowledge the parts maybe where they may be disadvantaged, but the parts where they are advantaged. And I think the last thing I would say is, in terms of universities, I think it comes from the top. So if you think, one of the comments that was actually in my book, I think it was a review somebody left, was that every university, I'm trying to think what the name is, gosh, what's the name? Pro-Vice Chancellor, I couldn't think of the name then. Every university Pro-Vice Chancellor should see this book, which was a really lovely comment to get. But actually, I couldn't have said it better myself. I think every university Pro-Vice Chancellor, this is not to suggest they may not be working class themselves, but it's important that they know the difficulties some of their lecturers do have and how this will impact on their students as well. So I just think, yeah, it's everybody's problem, everybody's issue to resolve, basically.
Well, I mean, Teresa, I mean, you and I could chat all afternoon, couldn't we? And is before we finish, I know you've got to scoot off for a meeting very shortly. Is there anything else that you would like to say?
I think if I'm speaking to lecturers, what I'd say is your research is so important and it's vital, but never ever forget about your students. And I don't just say that to curry favour or anything like that. I love working with my students, and I think it's important we never forget that universities, about research, it's vital, but please never ever forget about the students that you work with. Those students coming into university, I still remember sat in my main arts lecture hall thinking, and I truly thought for the first 6 months somebody was going to send me an email or just actually march me out of the lecture hall because I shouldn't be there. That's a horrible way to think that when you've actually taken the plunge to go into higher education. So I just think it's vital that at every stage we remember our students. I know how much our workload is huge, it's massive, and our research is vital, but students are, hopefully, they're going to be the next people like us in academia. So yeah, I just want to leave it on that.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. And I hope our future audience and listeners will enjoy our informal conversation. Thank you.
Oh, if any of your students actually want a copy of my book, feel free to let them email me and I can send them a copy. That's no problem. Free of charge, of course. So,
not to worry. And for our audiences, Teresa is on Twitter. Teresa, do you want to just share your Twitter handle?
Yeah, I think it's, so all one word, I think it's Dr. Teresa Crew. And actually, I always put the doctor in. At first I thought, oh, I'm not sure about that, but I thought, no, it's important that it's seen that hopefully a doctor does talk normal. Not every doctor talks in language that is not, you know, not accessible. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much, Teresa, and we'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.